Hi, everybody. Welcome to IS 310, this online version of the United Nations class that's been taught in, of, and through the Martin Institute at the University of Idaho for about 20 years. The UN is an interesting organization. It's one which I enjoy discussing, but it's not one I particularly promote or denigrate. It's one I like to look at and analyze and use as an umbrella under which to talk about any country in the world you want, any topic in the world you want, any group of peoples, they're all engaging with and connected to the UN in some way. Some of those are positive ways, some of them are negatives, and it's not my job to particularly preach at you or teach at you a certain way of looking at the UN, but rather to present you with a whole range of issues that you should have in order to understand what's going on at the UN and then formulate your own opinions. My name is Bill Smith. I'm the director of the Martin Institute and Program in International Studies and the Bora Foundation here at the University of Idaho. What these three things have in common is they look at the causes of war, the conditions necessary for peace, and the international system. And my job as director is to make sure that students who take a class from us or who have a major or a minor with us, the bachelor's in international studies, the minor in international studies, have an opportunity to explore those things that are most of interest to them. So a class like IS 310 and partner classes like IS 410 about NGOs in the international system, they sort of create an umbrella under which once you learn the pattern, you can pursue peculiar interests. And that's important for us in IS in particular because when you get to a senior class of 45 or 50 students, no two of them have the same curriculum. There's lots of different combinations of issue emphases and regional emphases and study abroad experiences that make it different. So instead of having one fixed thing that you study under the UN, there's opportunities to explore. And so for those of you coming from other fields on campus, that you'll have the same opportunity as well. That once we get through the first half of the semester, where we're talking about the pattern at the UN, then you'll have an opportunity to pursue topics and issues under the regional umbrella that most and topical umbrella, national umbrella that most interest you. It's a pretty cool thing to study here at the UI, and I look forward to telling you why here later in this conversation. All right, so let us talk about the UN and welcome you to New York. So New York City has the interesting opportunity to host the headquarters of the United Nations. Uh, you've probably heard of the concept of sovereignty. We're going to introduce it in the first lecture. We're going to talk about it in lots of lectures. So get used to that concept. But the concept of sovereignty and the rights of diplomats are typically afforded to representatives of foreign governments in national capitals. The United States is unique in that it has the the U.S. Capitol, where the ambassadors of a country to our country reside, and where there's some I don't know if you've ever heard of the concept of extraterritoriality. That's where there's a piece of a country that's controlled by another country. We have it sometimes on military bases abroad, certainly on our embassies abroad. And here in New York, the UN headquarters that you're seeing here in this picture, they occupy an extraterritorial portion of the island of Manhattan. So on the right here is the headquarters where the staff and secretariat of the UN operates. On the left here is the meeting hall for the General Assembly, the Economic and Social Council, the Security Council, and several others. It's right on the river, on the East River in New York City. It's an interesting challenge for New York. If you can imagine hosting all those embassies, all those special missions, and then all of the organizations that want to lobby and talk to those representatives, all in New York City. All the official diplomats having diplomatic immunity, having this big piece of territory that's valuable real estate in Manhattan, controlled by an international organization. There's a lot of pros and cons to it. The mayor's office in New York City actually has an office for international affairs that primarily deals with the UN and all the embassies. And there's a link here in this section of the class where you can explore the mayor's office for that. But it's unique. There are other places in the world where the UN has major headquarters, nothing to the extent that is here in New York. Geneva, for example, houses human rights and health conversations. Rome hosts food conversations. Nairobi, environmental conversations. And so there's several others like that where there's a piece of the UN, but the main headquarters is here in New York. I have the opportunity to take UI students to New York every spring to visit the UN and participate in a Model UN conference. By the way, if you are in this class hoping to have access to IS 320 and or the delegation, this is not the venue for that. You have to be in the in-person class. If that makes no sense to you, terrific. You're in the right place already. So New York is a very interesting spot where the UN is hosted, and it makes it unique that there's all those diplomats there in the city. The UN in the United States as a whole is often seen as occupying one of two extremes. It's either pernicious, it's an evil sort of thing that we have to beware because of its threats to our sovereignty, our rights to do and be whatever we want to be, to have the supreme power to control our own destiny as a country, or it's a panacea. It's an opportunity to really right the wrongs of the world, and I think it's a much more complicated uh, picture than that. Now, let's start with this one on the left, the pernicious part. You know, in the United Nations is always talking about what we'll look at as this exchange of sovereignty for benefits into an ever growing, almost always growing series of agreements, resolutions, treaties, declarations that look to do things in common. And each time you do something in common, you run the risk of having each individual country lose the ability to approach that singularly, the way they want. So for some people in the United States, any chance of an international organization telling us what we might want to do is a threat to our sovereignty, and they want to get us out of the United Nations. I know there were, in the 1980s when I was coming of age, there were certainly conversations about the UN that pitched it as a front for the communist states of the world to organize and try and have the communist countries in the Cold War tell us and our allies what to do. In the 90s, when the X-Files first came on the air and other things were sort of tapping the zeitgeist of perhaps the UN as a forerunner of one world government, that the UN had secret helicopters and militaries that were going to land and force us to do things. Obviously, I think those are untrue. Part of that is you'll explore as you come through the class in terms of what the UN has the rights to do. And that's something once you understand, the pattern will make more sense and you'll know. Those same people think the UN is ineffective, and it's hard to have sort of those two narratives. It reminds me of people who sort of simultaneously think, for example, that in their conspiracy theories that George Bush was both responsible for 9/11 and too incompetent to do anything else, but he could carry out the greatest, one of the greatest con jobs in history with 9/11. Certainly for me here at the Martin Institute, I've received phone calls from people looking to have us stop talking about the UN. And I sort of give them the syllabus and give us our spiel about not promoting the UN. And here in Idaho, we have, uh, when I first started here, the city of Post Falls was debating a resolution to forbid the flying of the UN flag or the promotion of the United Nations in any way, which was interesting because there was none of that beforehand. I remember the mayor saying, well, I didn't even know this was a thing here because it wasn't a thing. And it eventually sort of died out at the end of that year, but it was a spot here uh, in Idaho where that narrative exists. On the right here, you'll see the people who talk about the positives of the UN and what it might deliver. These are the images of the 17 global goals. They're called the Sustainable Development Goals, and that the UN is the best venue to deliver action and success on these things. And there are issues throughout history where the UN has played a major role, oftentimes through one of its sub-agencies, like the World Health Organization, at delivering some very exciting change. And when we look at later in the semester the transition from something called the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals, you'll see where there's this approach. But for folks who really see it as a panacea and for the way to get all good in the world, collective good in the world accomplished, they also have a simplistic view of the UN that is a positive one. So I see it as neither pernicious nor a panacea, but a complex thing. I also don't have all the answers. This is a big, giant, complex organization, and I look forward to answering your questions and pointing to you to places to answer your own questions. But I hope you don't expect me to have all of the answers. One of the interesting things when sometimes people say, oh, you're an expert on the United Nations, I try and imagine what percentage of the organization I actually know and understand. And man, if it's 10% on a good day, I'd be pretty happy. But 10% of this massive organization is just scratching the surface. So lots of stuff going there. So our purpose, what are we going to do? We're going to look at the pros and cons, the strengths and weaknesses of the organization. We're also going to look at it in the roles it plays in the causes of war, the conditions for peace, and the international system. And then how countries act and interact within that larger umbrella. So they're acting and they're interacting, and those things are not the same thing, as I think you'll see. One of the things that the organization is most proud of is as a venue for conversation and discussion. That even if your two countries don't have diplomatic relations, for example, the United States and Cuba for many, many decades, Iran and Israel even today, and the list is long, at the UN, they're there at the same time. So even if it would be very impolitic and awkward for a country to exchange direct diplomatic relations, they've got a venue where they can talk, where the diplomats are located at all times. So that's useful. Um, so that's what we'll be up to, and you'll be able to engage through the first half of the class on the pattern related to the organization, and the latter half of the class on a particular region and a particular country. Why is it cool to study at the UI? Well, let me introduce you to Boyd and Grace Martin. Boyd Martin here on the left was a professor of political science at the University of Idaho, originally from Kamiah, Idaho. I have a picture on the wall in my office of taken from the land he and Grace owned. They had a wheat farm. And so it's taken from there looking at Kamiah, and it sort of reminds me of this connection from rural Idaho to the globe. In 1939, they were young marrieds at Stanford University, listening to the radio when Hitler and the Nazis invaded Poland, and they pledged at that time to save up money over the course of their lifetime and endow an institute that would look at why people go to war and how you can keep major conflicts from happening. And obviously that bore fruit. That's why we have the name of the institute today, which in and of itself is a cool thing. But the reason it's interesting to study the UN specifically is in 1945, they were young marrieds living in Moscow, Idaho, where he was a professor in the Department of Political Science. He received a phone call from the president, not of the university, but of the United States, Harry S. Truman, asking him to go to San Francisco and serve on the staff of Senator Vandenberg, who was the main representative of the United States to the negotiations about the UN Charter. So the Charter is a document that lays out the rights and responsibilities of both the organization and the member states. So we have a direct Idaho connection to the negotiation and formalization of the foundational document of the major intergovernmental organization of our time. And that's a pretty cool thing. So Boyd Martin has the connection. Obviously, then the institute that he founded has the opportunity, the right, the responsibility to talk about the UN and teach about it going forward. So it's a pretty cool opportunity. If you ever get to come up to our conference room, we've got portraits of Boyd and Grace on the wall. We've also got a bucket of wheat that came from the farm, a harvest from the farm, to remind us of our connection back to rural Idaho. So connecting Idaho and the globe. So where do we go from here? So that's an interesting question. What we have in terms of the course introduction, we're studying how countries act and interact, the international system, and we'll be looking at a wide range of issues. We'll also be together as much as we can in an online course space. I decided in sort of a radical departure not to schedule any formal discussions, but I'm going to open a conversation board where I hope people will visit. It's going to be totally non-graded. You'll be able to express your ideas, explore as you wish in there, and that's what I'll have it for. So this is what we're studying. We're at the UN, at the UI, and away we go.